Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at a research paper with a pretty hefty title.
Oh, yeah.
1-year follow-up of a remote-delivered Koru Mindfulness RCT intervention for college students during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Wow. That's a mouthful.
I know, right? But what caught my eye was that it's a 1-year follow-up study. We're going to be looking at the long-term effects of a mindfulness program.
I see. So it's not just about those immediate benefits. We get to see how things shake out over time.
Exactly. And this study was done by some researchers from the Georgia Tech School of Psychology, Grazia Mirabito, Lekha Koganti, and Verhaeghen. They were focusing on something called the Koru Mindfulness Program. It's a 4-week program designed specifically for college students.
And delivered remotely during the pandemic, right? That adds a whole other dimension to things, doesn't it?
It really does. The pandemic was a tough time for everyone, especially those college students.
No kidding.
In fact, the study mentions that even before the pandemic hit, 58% of college students were already reporting more than average or tremendous stress levels.
Yikes. That's from the National College Health Assessment.
Right. So you can imagine how much the pandemic probably added to that.
Absolutely. So before we dive into the specifics of this study, maybe we should back up a bit. For folks who might not be familiar, could you give us a quick rundown on what mindfulness is and why it's seen as a potential solution for things like stress and well-being?
Sure thing. Mindfulness is basically the practice of being present in the moment without judgment. It's about noticing your thoughts and feelings as they come up, but not getting carried away by them.
Sort of like being an observer of your own mind.
Exactly. And studies have shown that mindfulness can help regulate emotions, reduce stress and anxiety, and even improve focus and self-compassion.
So how does this Koru mindfulness program fit into all of this?
Well, the Koru program uses a bunch of different mindfulness techniques like body scan meditation, mindful breathing, and walking meditation.
And in this study, they taught it all online.
Right. Because of the pandemic, everything had to be remote.
Makes you wonder how effective that was compared to in-person instruction.
That's one of the things the researchers were looking at.
Okay, so let's get into the findings then. What did they discover after a year?
Well, they used a statistical analysis called MENOVIA.
Getting technical already.
Just a bit. But basically, they compared the group who did the Koru training to a control group who didn't.
Looking for any lasting changes across a whole bunch of mental and emotional measures.
Exactly.
So did they find any significant long-term benefits?
They did. A year after the program, 4 out of the 21 variables they were tracking showed significant improvement in the group who did the Koru program compared to the control group.
Interesting. Which areas showed improvement?
Things like non-reactivity, negative affect, autonomy, and positive relationships.
Some of those are a little jargony. Mind breaking those down for us?
Sure. Non-reactivity is like being able to notice your emotions without immediately reacting to them.
Not letting them take over, basically.
Right. Creating some space between a feeling and how you respond to it. So left knee-jerk reaction, more thoughtful response.
Gotcha. How about negative affect? What's that all about?
Negative affect is basically the experience of negative emotions, things like sadness, anger, anxiety, and so on.
So if they saw a decrease in negative affect, it means participants were feeling fewer of those bad vibes even a year later.
Yep.
Makes sense. What about the other two, autonomy and positive relationships?
Autonomy has to do with feeling in control of your choices in your life. You know, like you're calling the shots.
So the program might have helped people feel more empowered.
That's the idea. And then positive relationships, that refers to the quality of connections with other people.
So the Koru folks were reporting better relationships even a year later.
That's what the study found.
Seems like the program had some lasting benefits, even delivered online. But didn't you say earlier that 16 variables showed improvement right after the program? Now it's down to 4.
Good catch. You're right, there was a big difference in the number of variables that showed improvement immediately compared to a year later.
So what happened? Did the benefits just fade over time?
That's a great question. And to get to the bottom of it, we'll need to dig into how they measured these changes and what other factors might have been at play.
Well, to get a clearer picture of why some of those initial benefits might have faded, it helps to understand how they actually measured these changes. They used a bunch of different standardized questionnaires and scales, stuff that's pretty common in psychology research.
So it's like they gave participants these mental and emotional checkups.
Exactly. So for mindfulness, for example, they used the 5-facet mindfulness questionnaire, or FFNQ for short. It breaks mindfulness down into 5 different aspects: observing, describing, acting with awareness, non-judging, and non-reactivity.
I see. So it's not just about being mindful in general. They were looking at how that mindfulness showed up in different parts of people's lives.
Precisely. And they used other well-established tools as well, like the Penn State Worry Questionnaire for worry, the Ruminative Responses Scale for rumination, and the PANAS, which stands for the Positive and Negative Effects Schedule, to get a sense of mood.
Okay, so they had a pretty comprehensive set of tools to keep track of all these changes over time. You mentioned earlier that while only 4 areas showed really clear improvements after a year, there were still some positive trends in other areas, right? Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. While those other areas didn't quite reach what we'd call statistical significance at the 1-year mark, the researchers did notice that the group who went through the Koru program tended to score better than the control group in things like stress, anxiety, even sleep quality.
So even though those improvements weren't super strong a year out, it's possible that the program still had some lingering positive effects.
Yeah, that's a plausible explanation. But remember, immediately after the program, we saw significant improvements in 16 out of those 21 variables.
16. Yeah, I remember. That's a pretty big jump from 4.
Right. So what happened? Well, one factor that might have contributed to this drop-off is that most people didn't really keep practicing mindfulness once the program was over.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Kind of like learning a new language or an instrument. If you don't keep practicing, you start to lose some of those skills.
Exactly. The study found that, most participants only practice mindfulness like once a month or even less.
Wow, that's not a lot. But did the people who did stick with it even a little bit? Did they see any extra benefits?
That's the interesting part. They did find a connection, albeit a small one, between continued practice and better results, especially in areas like acting with awareness, non-judging, and reducing stress, worry, and anxiety.
So even a little bit of regular practice seems to have made a difference. That's encouraging.
It is. It shows that you don't necessarily need to be meditating for an hour every day to see some benefits. Even incorporating small moments of mindfulness into your routine can make a difference.
Speaking of routine, I think we need to talk about the elephant in the room here, the pandemic. This entire program happened remotely during a pretty stressful time for everyone. Do you think that had an impact on the study's findings?
That's a really good question, and it's something the researchers acknowledged as well. It's likely that the pandemic had a pretty complex effect on the results, both good and bad.
Okay, I'm curious. How so?
Well, on the one hand, the fact that the program was online might have actually made it more accessible for some students. Maybe they couldn't have made it to in-person sessions because of their schedule or location, or maybe they just felt more comfortable learning online. Plus, they could practice from anywhere with an internet connection.
So the pandemic might have actually removed some barriers for certain participants.
Exactly. But on the other hand, being online might have made it harder for some students to really connect with the material, the instructors, and the other people in the group. They might have missed out on that in-person interaction, the immediate feedback, and the sense of community.
It's that human element, isn't it? Sometimes that can make all the difference.
Absolutely. And then there's the added layer of stress that everyone was dealing with because of the pandemic. It's hard to know for sure how much of the changes they saw were due to the Koru program itself versus just the general craziness of living through that time.
That's a fair point. It's all intertwined, isn't it? But if we had to sum up the main takeaway about the pandemic's influence, what would it be?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the pandemic presented both challenges and opportunities. It showed that delivering mindfulness interventions online is definitely possible and can reach a wider audience, but it also highlighted how important it is to create a sense of connection and support, even in a virtual setting.
So it's not just about the program itself, but also the context in which it's delivered and the support system that's there to help people along the way.
Exactly. And that leads us to another important point from the study, the idea that continued support is key, even after that initial 4-week program ends.
Yeah, continued support. That makes sense. It's kind of like, when you have a personal trainer at the gym, they can get you started, teach you the exercises, but ultimately it's up to you to actually keep going back and putting in the work.
I like that analogy. And when it comes to mindfulness, that continued support could look like offering those little booster sessions, maybe some drop-in mindfulness groups, or even just giving people access to resources like guided meditations or online communities.
Creating a structure, a community, that helps people keep practicing after the main program is done. But I'm kind of curious about those folks who did manage to keep practicing, even without all that extra help. Did the study say anything about what they were doing?
You know, it did. The researchers found that the techniques people used most often were breath awareness and belly breathing.
Interesting. Those are both pretty simple, straightforward techniques, even for beginners. Maybe that's why people were more likely to stick with them.
Could be. It definitely reinforces the idea that mindfulness doesn't have to be super complicated or time-consuming. Just a few minutes of focused breathing can have a real impact.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about what makes this study unique, the key findings, the role of continued practice, and even the pandemic's influence. But now I'm thinking, what does all this mean for our listeners? What are the big takeaways here?
I think that's the most important question. And to me, this study really highlights a few things. First off, it shows that even a short online mindfulness program can have some real lasting benefits for well-being, especially for college students. They're going through a lot, so it's great to see something that can help them cope.
And we're not just talking about some fleeting sense of calm, right? We're talking about real improvements in things like emotional regulation, self-control, even the quality of their relationships a year down the road.
Exactly. Mindfulness isn't just a quick fix. It's a practice that can change how we see ourselves, how we deal with our emotions, and how we interact with the world around us.
And even though it can be tough to stick with a mindfulness practice, especially on your own, this study shows that even little bits of regular practice can make a big difference. Less stress, more self-awareness, better relationships, all from taking a few moments to be mindful.
Absolutely. It's all about finding what works for you, how you can fit mindfulness into your daily life in a way that feels good and that you can keep up with.
Couldn't agree more. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap things up?
Yeah, I'd say this. Maintaining a mindfulness practice, especially when things are tough, it's a challenge. So think about what strategies might work for you. How can you weave those little moments of mindfulness into your day? Maybe it's setting a reminder to take a few deep breaths before you start your morning, or practicing mindful eating during a meal, or even just taking a minute to really appreciate the beauty of nature.
All great ideas. Finding those little pockets of peace and presence in your day wherever you can.
Exactly. And remember, mindfulness isn't about achieving some perfect state of bliss. It's about showing up for yourself with awareness, with kindness, with compassion in each moment, just as it is.
Well said. A huge thank you to our expert for walking us through all of this fascinating research. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Remember, even small steps towards mindfulness can have a big impact on your well-being. Go out there and find your own mindfulness groove.